All right, so let's get started. Everyone here knows me right now, but I'll reintroduce myself. I'm Morgan Wells, the Director of Center for Creative Inquiry, and today is the second event in the Creative Inquiry into the Law series, where I foolishly try to combine TSK, or in this case, full presence mindfulness practice, with my legal background and try to see what comes out of that. So the topic today will not quote extensively from the TSK books, but will actually draw from full presence mindfulness. So no pressure there, since the founder of Full Presence Mindfulness, Jack Petranker, is here. So he can always step in and correct me if I misstate something. So with that, I'll get started. And I expect to go kind of similar to last time, maybe for 25 to 30 minutes. And then afterward, just kind of see how it landed with everyone and kind of open it up for discussion. So each of these is going to be a little different. So today, the talk is called The Gravity of the Past, which I later decided was kind of misnamed. I should have probably called it The Gravity of Stories. But here's the title we're stuck with. So The Gravity of the Past. And what I wanted to look at is really the issue of incarceration in the United States and what that could mean um, for full presence mindfulness practice in particular. So the underlying premise of the talk is, or the claim I will try to make, is that full presence mindfulness is not an ethically neutral practice, and that it changes our vision such that our way of engaging the world also changes. And this might be maybe kind of pushing the edges of things a little bit, in that I do think that it's important to emphasize that as we're engaging in practice of full presence mindfulness or TSK, that we're really not wanting to get lost in content. And I think the ability to kind of zoom out and looking at structures, space and time beyond content is very important, but that does not necessarily mean that we can't take a stance, or that it's content neutral, or that, in other words, are ethically neutral and that everything is the same. There's a tendency, I think, at times for practitioners to maybe pull things in too much in a nihilistic direction, in that, well, as long as I'm engaging my practice, I'm going to like expand out, open to everything, and then everything is okay. And then kind of taking this kind of ultimate view and then allowing it to really kind of reinforce existing kind of pattern, or maybe even justify existing patterns that might still be left within the sphere of content and not be investigated. So that's kind of the premise I'm bringing here today, is that if we're engaging in full presence mindfulness, we are not necessarily engaging in ethically neutral practice, that a stance may actually emerge. And the context in which I am presenting that premise today will be incarceration a little bit later on. So first, to kind of back up what I'm trying to claim here, I want to start out with kind of a basic idea of what does it mean to be human? What does humanity mean? What is the meaning behind being human? And I think there's many different ways that you can answer that question. And I'm sure each one of us would answer it a little bit differently. But I wanted to present just two possible ways of answering that question of what it really means to be human. The first, I'm going to borrow from Tibetan Buddhism. And this isn't a talk on Tibetan Buddhism, but the idea of a precious human birth, which is one of the four thoughts that turn the mind to the Dharma, or the four preliminaries, is that this precious human birth is something that urges us to turn towards spiritual practice because it's a special opportunity. We're born with this capacity to learn, to study, to grow, and that is something that should be taken full advantage of. We should be living that to the fullest and cherishing that precious human birth. So again, kind of extracting from that this kind of idea that being human is an opportunity to cherish. And the second way I want to possibly look at maximizing our human potential is from the lens of full presence mindfulness, which fortunately it's loaded right into the title, that being fully present to living experience on all its dimensions is kind of the fundamental meaning of being human, if I may use words such as fundamental in this context. There's a quality of wholeness there, of multidimensionality and completeness. Instead of cutting off or settling for something less than, something more narrowed and self-centered, we are expanding into the wholeness of being and really wanting to open up our faculties 360 and really kind of be fully present and in our lives, in our living experience. So full presence mindfulness, to go into it a little bit more, as much as I can in an overview slide, one overview slide. So when we're talking about full presence mindfulness, we're talking about an approach that centers the whole of living experience, or the entire field of experience, and decenters the self as the central agent of experience. So one aspect of that is breaking free from the gravity of stories or told stories. We assign labels and tell stories that kind of stand in for living experience, for that dynamic living experience. And those kind of static, kind of dead stories that we tell, or through our thoughts and otherwise, pull us toward the past, right? So this is where the title comes from. We have this gravity of thought, a gravity of told stories where we have a living experience, and we can be fully present to that living experience, but we are often settling on a static, dead story, stepping in and us mistaking that static story, that told story, as what is real, as what our experience actually is and should be. So it's a limitation. And it also deadens our experience because the way we've pinned that to the past keeps us referring back to something that has already happened and assuming that that does not change. So that is what we mean by told stories. These stories are flat and lifeless, and we mistake them as being the whole. But the whole is living, the whole is dynamic and constantly moving. So taking these flat stories, or this idea of the told story, and turning to a word that has been fascinating to me. So we talked about what it means to be human. So what does it mean to dehumanize? What is something that is dehumanizing? It's a word I hear a lot recently, and it kind of fascinated me a little bit. So I put it into the talk. So if human being has this quality of wholeness, of full presence, what does it mean to dehumanize? So in our ordinary usage, dehumanizing is usually means treating someone as lesser, either by taking away their rights or reducing them to a label, or otherwise mistreating that person. Oh, he's just a monster, right? The person becomes just a monster, or just a terrorist, or just a whatever, and their wholeness, their humanness kind of falls away from view. They become nothing but this label or this story about them. So when we're talking about dehumanizing and this reduction to a label, you can even look at the language. We're literally kind of taking the human from something. So dehumanize, desalinate, construct, right? We're not constructing, we're deconstructing, we're taking it apart, right? So when we're dehumanizing, we're literally taking the humanity from someone, taking the humanness from someone. So this is analogous to reducing human being to told stories. So if we're talking about dehumanization, as I said in the previous slide, if we're treating someone as less than whole, or as less than a whole multidimensional person. But we shouldn't limit this definition necessarily to moments when we are mistreating people. If we look at dehumanization this way, reducing someone to a mere label or to a role in a story is not just something we're doing when we're unkind, but we're doing it all the time. And we're not just doing it to our enemies or people we don't like, we're doing it to ourselves, to our friends, to everyone in our circle. It is our ordinary way of being in the world, our unexamined way of being in the world, seems to involve dehumanizing ourselves and others. The self does the dehumanizing. The self reduces experience to a story and then allows the told story to stand in for the whole of experience. So the self is engaged in this dehumanizing process. And that process, right, the same kind of activity of the self that we're referring to when we ordinarily say dehumanization, and when we're practicing kind of full presence mindfulness and talking about told stories, that's the very limiting view that our practice is trying to break open. So we've presumably engaged this practice because we want to experience fullness. We want to experience the whole potential of our being. And so what we are trying to do is to, as much as possible, tune into that wholeness and catch ourselves or be aware of when we are engaging in this dehumanizing pattern. That doesn't mean we stop labeling. It doesn't mean we stop telling stories. The issue is that we mistake them for real. So when I say this standing in part, right? So that's why the previous slide had a strawberry on it, right? No, it was two slides ago, I had a strawberry, right? To remind myself to talk about the strawberry example. So if you taste a strawberry and then it's your first time tasting a strawberry, let's say, and you've decided, oh, I like strawberries. Then every subsequent time you eat strawberries, you're not really tasting the strawberry. Usually it's replaced by the story of, oh, I'm someone who likes strawberries. Or maybe for me, it would be potatoes, right? Morgan is someone who likes potatoes. And then the story becomes kind of dominant and stepping in for the experience. It's a very simple example, right? So so it's not the problem that we're placing the label. It's the problem is that the label becomes our truth, or we think that it becomes our truth. So what's the suggestion here? I have this kind of trippy slide here to show movement, the dynamic movement. The suggestion here is that engaging full presence includes questioning and disrupting dehumanizing social patterns that concretize and draw us into told stories. In other words, that our practice demands that we engage with told stories where we see them manifesting in society, and to effectively take a stance that minimizes our fixation or fascination on these reductive told stories. So that's my argument for that premise. So how does this move to the next slide? There. So with that kind of setup, let me move to incarceration and our way of incarcerating people in the United States. So why did I choose incarceration as a area of exploration? Well, it's a considerable problem in the United States, I think most would say. So let me just very briefly touch on the situation of mass incarceration in the United States. Of course, if you do not know, incarceration is when we put people in prison for committing crimes. So in the United States, there are approximately 2 million incarcerated people at any given time, which represents a 500% increase since the 1970s. That's a five-fold increase in the last 4 or 5 decades. This increase is not attributable to an increase in crime rates, nor is it attributable to the increase in the population size. In fact, it is almost solely attributable to the war on drugs and changes in sentencing policy. In other words, the US government and state governments have actively chosen a policy that puts more people in prison. This has been our policy choice as a nation. And in fact, the US has now the highest incarceration rate in the world, and that is both per capita and by volume. And when we talk about this incarceration rate, it also reflects significant racial disparities. Black people are incarcerated at 4 times the rate as white people, and if you look solely at male prison, men's prisons, it's 6 times the rate. So this mass incarceration is a policy. It's something that our country has been engaging in. And it's a significant problem that is not correlated with crime rates. It doesn't mean people are committing more crimes and that's why more people are going to jail. It just means we've decided that we want to put more people in prison. Well, why do we do this? Why do we incarcerate people, and why have we been incarcerating so many people? I mentioned the war on drugs, and so which of course represents a lot of crimes that are being given prison sentences for things that are often not violent crimes or directly creating risk to society. Well, there are several underlying theories to criminal justice. So there's several underlying justifications that have been offered throughout the years. And one thing to be aware of is that the justifications that are often that people think are underlying the criminal justice system are not usually actually the most prominent reasons or the most prominent features in our criminal justice system. So if I asked you if you had an idea of what were the justifications, many of you might mention the issue of rehabilitation. The idea that, okay, so there's someone who's committed a crime, we're going to put them in prison, and then while they're in prison, maybe they engage in programs that kind of improve their improve their education or involve therapy. And then at the end of that prison sentence, they will be able to be reintegrated effectively into society. Now, that would be great, and it is perhaps more prominent in the juvenile justice system, the rehabilitation model. And there are, of course, some programs aimed at rehabilitation in prison, but by and large, it is not the dominant or predominant reason or value being promoted by incarceration. And we know this because the recidivism rates, have a hard time pronouncing that word, are very high. So many offenders end up reoffending in just a few years. And by and large, if the project of incarceration is rehabilitation, it would be doing quite a poor job. So the next theory that someone might offer is incapacitation, which by that means, oh, well, we don't want the person to be a threat to society anymore because they're dangerous, and therefore we are going to put them in prison where they can no longer do harm. Again, not really the most prominent underlying justification, but it's one that's frequently thought of as the purpose of prison. The third is a punitive angle of deterrence. And this one probably features a little bit more prominently in incapacitation. The idea of, oh, well, I'm going to punish, having a harsh punishment for this type of behavior will deter people from engaging in that behavior to begin with. And or it will be an incentive to not do the bad thing again, right? Not commit the same crime again. Of course, again, with recidivism rates, it's pretty indicative that punitive deterrence is not the primary underlying theory for criminal justice. And in fact, it's pretty indisputed at this point in the legal industry that the fourth is the most prominent one and is by far the most widely accepted and used is retribution. The reason we incarcerate people in the United States is because of retribution. So what is retribution? So this is what we call the just desserts justification. So the idea is wrongdoers deserve to be punished, and they should be punished in proportion to the degree of their wrongdoing. So retribution is fundamentally backward looking. This isn't a TSK view. This is what the scholars have described described this philosophy as. It's not grounded in forward-looking reasons such as safety or safety of the public or deterrence or compensating the victim. Retribution doesn't care about any future consequences. It's about the principle of it. It's about the principle of achieving justice. It is not a consequentialist approach. It doesn't care about the consequences, right? An eye for an eye. Okay, you did something bad. You deserve to be punished. So that is the theory that's actually underlying most of our punishments in the United States, pretty expressly, even in legislative history and legislative documentation. So retribution finds satisfaction in the suffering of the wrongdoer in and of itself. So the suffering of the wrongdoer is what is trying to be achieved with retribution, and there is no future goal. And one scholar had a nice quote: retribution is nothing more than well-dressed revenge. It's intended to satisfy our urge to want to see the perpetrator punished in a way that is more civilized than mere vengeance. So that is retribution. So, and that is the predominant model of punishment and incarceration in the United States today. And we see this in terms of why mass incarceration keeps increasing. So is retribution compatible with full presence? Well, I would say that it's the least compatible with the idea of full presence. For incarcerated persons, the gravity of the past is proportionate to the severity of the crime. So if they've done something that society has deemed, or that we've collectively deemed very, very bad, that is a very weighty focal point that is hooked into the past and creates a story that they are quite literally confined, right, in the prison system for a duration of time in that space. They are locked into that story depending on its weightiness. The whole person is reduced to the story of their crime. Their rehabilitation does not matter. How they are re-entering the world at the end of their sentence does not matter. The purpose of retribution is to lock that story into place for the appropriate duration of time. So the story goes that so long as they are in prison, they deserve to be there, and justice is served, and they are released from the story only when they complete that sentence. And then it is no longer deserved. They get to be a person again. So retribution, by its very nature, is backwards looking, right? It fixates on the past and simply holds the person in place until it's satisfied, and there is no forward or present look or present purpose to that model. So the question might arise as I bring this up, but why should I care? about dehumanizing criminals. That's not my story. And I would say that it is, that you've just told your story. Because the story of incarceration and the story of someone getting what they deserve is in itself another story. And this urge to dismiss the problem as other, right? Creating that distance, creating that separation is an example of how we've been pulled into that story. So that told story is justifying and obscuring the present infliction of suffering by the state. And that present infliction is actually something in which we're participating when we participate in the political process and whatever positions we support, right? So that told story that's pulled us to the past, that, oh, it's not our problem and they deserve it, is actually the story that's pulling us back to the past. That is the story that has gravity, and it's a very hard urge to overcome. So that's what in this next quote from Van Willigenberg, the urge for punitive retribution is a primitive instinct, is how he characterizes it. There's a very strong urge. We want to see the person get the justice due. And it has a strong gravity that's free to break from. We don't like to let go of wrongdoing. So it's pulling us in. And it's in fact that gravity of that story, that someone deserves it, is actually pulling in everyone and everything. So it not only draws in the offender, but also the victim and the public, because retributive justice is a unilateral procedure imposed by the state. It has no regard for the outcomes of for the public. It has no regard for whether the public is safer or if there are shared values being upheld. It has no regard for the victim and whether or not that particular result is healing and restoring dignity for that victim. So that victim is a passive recipient of a story that the court says, hey, we got it. It's done. Look, justice just happened. And they are meant to simply adopt that kind of flat story as, okay, well, that's my truth now. I received justice or I didn't receive justice. So as I bring this up, then the question says, so what approaches to criminal justice may be more compatible with our practice? If we're going to support a position, well, what approaches would be more compatible? And I would say pretty much any of them would be better than retribution. On one level, any of the other previously mentioned models, which include rehabilitation, incapacitation, or deterrence, is preferable because these are consequentialist justifications sorry, that aim to reduce the recurrence of harm. So in other words, it is telling a story. They are also telling stories, but the aim of that story is not simply just let's inflict some suffering on someone, right? There is actually an aim to reduce the reoccurrence of harm, right? Of future harm. That's one level, but on another level, I think it would be an interesting exploration to really see if we centered our values of humanity and wholeness that we're trying to encourage in our lives. We might come up with newer and creative approaches, and there are in fact some newer approaches that I find quite interesting. So centering those values as a foundation for responding to harm. So what types of values? Well, maybe more forward-facing values that consider kind of the living experience of the parties involved, but while also acknowledging the past. We don't just want to throw away the past or write it off, but acknowledging it instead of kind of pinning it down as the sole source of meaning. The second would be honoring and acknowledging the wholeness of all parties, right? So actually actively taking into account the humanity of the victim and letting their agency participate in the process, and honoring and acknowledge the humanity of the perpetrator, the conditions that led them to offend, and how healing could occur on both sides. and also allowing, again, for the living dynamic story to emerge. So if we're thinking about these values, two of the approaches that are out there and are still very, well, one of them is, I think, not implemented anywhere, but is just in scholarship. And the other is kind of on the fringes of things. So the first is restorative justice. And I don't intend to end every talk with restorative justice. It's kind of coincidental that I've ended the last talk and this talk with restorative justice. But the interesting part about that model of criminal justice is it's a bilateral process that centers the victim's story rather than the perpetrator's story. So the aim of that bilateral process where the victim is also involved is to repair harm and restore their dignity. And so in a sense, one could say that it elevates the living story of the victim and reduces the gravity of the told story of the offender. They still might, I mean, that story is still there, but it's decentered as the primary consideration for how the procedure commences. The other one that I just stumbled across in that I thought was very interesting is called the public health quarantine model of justice. So this compares dangerous criminals to the carriers of dangerous diseases that you might quarantine. So we've all been through COVID, so we are familiar with quarantine. So we only quarantine carriers of diseases to the extent necessary to protect the public. So this scales the response to criminal wrongdoing to future risk rather than past magnitude. So I find that interesting how forward-facing that is. It's proportionate to the risk rather than proportionate to the past story. It also respects the humanity of the offender by doing no more harm to them as necessary. So in that sense, okay, you've committed a crime, you could be considered a dangerous offender. We're going to quarantine you from the public and then prioritize swift rehabilitation and reintegration as soon as you are fit to re-enter society effectively, right? So as soon as you are less of a danger. So in that sense, it is an approach to criminal justice that is focused on protecting the public and protecting the victim and allowing them to feel safe while also still acknowledging the humanity and honoring the humanity of the offender. That precious human birth. So those are two of the approaches, and then that's my talk. So basically, if we're looking at different models of incarceration and what we might support, just thinking about that retribution is probably not the model to support or engage in if we really want to take our practice seriously. So that's my argument. And that's it.